Emerged on Earth. I see recording in progress. Let me just click.
Apologies, Jeremy. I went ahead and recorded. Yeah,
absolutely fine. As we know, life evolved on Earth billions of years ago, but it's really only been the last couple of 100,000 years that one species emerged that had this amazing power to actually affect pretty much all of the rest of life on this Earth. And so it's reasonable to ask then, well, how have we been doing with this power? And as we all know only too well, we seem to be doing a pretty crappy job, quite frankly, of handling this power. I used to talk about specific areas of climate breakdown, but now they're just so worldwide that wherever we look, there's wildfires, floods, drought of historic proportions. And we know that all these things are only going to get worse, even under the best case scenario. We know that we're facing a climate emergency, and we're on track right now to hit global heating this century that sober scientists are calling catastrophic. Even the 2 degrees, which right now is looking like an optimistic projection, scientists have been calling a prescription for disaster. Because of the zone of cascading amplifying feedbacks that the climate breakdown can hit. But here's the thing, like, even if we were to somehow find some sort of magic bullet that could solve the climate problem and enable us to not hit these targets, we've really got to understand that the climate emergency is just one symptom of a far greater problem that humans have brought on the Earth right now, that we're facing vast ecological destruction across the board. Since 1970, there's been a 68% decline in animal populations across the whole world. We are looking right now at the 6th great extinction of species since life began on Earth. Only this is the first extinction caused by one particular species, which is us. We are looking at the virtual certain annihilation of coral reefs worldwide this century, probably by the middle of this century. And the UN has forecast that 95% of Earth's land will be degraded by 2050. But of all these statistics, the one that blows me away the most is this one, that at the current rates, by 2050, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. And all this is the result of what has been called by earth scientists the great acceleration in consumption and production that you can just see from this chart has basically been taking place mostly since the end of the Second World War. Almost any dimension you look at has just been exploding and continues to explode. In fact, the mainstream economists believe that they project that our global production and consumption has caused all these problems so far is projected to triple by no later than mid-century, which is why we're rapidly heading for a precipice. And some earth scientists have produced this model looking at planetary boundaries of 9 different boundaries for a safe operating space for humanity. We've already broken through 4 of those boundaries. And world scientists are saying things like, soon it'll be too late to shift course from our failing trajectory. Leading prominent Professor Hans Schallenhuber talks about a big risk will end our civilization. And the previous UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon talked about it as a global suicide pact. So how have we gotten to this place? Well, that's the question we need to ask first. And in fact, as Garrett mentioned, in my earlier book, The Patterning Instinct, I looked at actually the different ways in which through human culture, through civilization, we came to this place right now. And what really that book distilled, the essence of the book, is that culture shapes values, and those values shape history. And by the same token, our values today are what will shape the future. So what are our values today? Well, basically, they're based on separation. I always view this picture as iconic of our values because here's everyone separate from each other, connected with their technology, separate even from the food they're eating. And the modern story of separation that underlies virtually every conversation in the media, every interview, every article goes something like this, that nature is a machine, that humans are separate from nature, that humans are separate from each other, that human progress arises from the conquest of nature, and that the earth itself is really just a resource to exploit for human benefit. And ultimately, as a result of all this, the purpose of life is essentially to get wealthy and powerful. Now, in this new book, The Web of Meaning, what I show and what I'll be taking you through in this presentation today is that every one of those assumptions is false. They're not only dangerous and driving us to the precipice, but we see that they are actually wrong. And what we'll be looking at is how modern sciences, such as neuroscience, complexity science, evolutionary biology, and systems science, actually point us to the same deep underlying understanding that traditional wisdom has been talking about for millennia, such as indigenous knowledge around the world, Taoism or Buddhism. And that's the understanding of our intrinsic interconnectedness. And we're going to look at these questions by actually looking at some of the deepest existential questions that probably every human being asks at some point in their lives. Questions like, who am I? Where am I? What am I? How should I live? And ultimately, why am I? So let's just begin by looking at that first question, who am I? And if you look at what the modern dominant culture tells us who we are, most of the time we get the answer something like from this source of Descartes from just a few hundred years ago, who made basically the most famous statement in philosophy, right? I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. And that has been underlying the foundation of basically most philosophical thought in the global mainstream since then. And what that implies, if you look underneath that statement, is that human identity exists solely through our conceptualizing faculty. And as a result, animals and even our bodies are basically just mere machines, mere kind of housing for our true identity. But what biologists now understand is that animals are most definitely not machines. We now know that elephants communicate over hundreds of miles through infrasound. They perform ceremonies over dead family members. We know that dolphins and whales actually are believed to talk to each other, even in local dialects. They call each other out by name. And scientists think that they gossip about those who are temporarily absent. Wolves, we know, show deep family commitment. Males help raise the young until they reach maturity. But it's one thing to look at high-functioning mammals and recognize the warmth and depth of intelligence there. But what we now know is that even plants have a networked intelligence. Plants have actually a distributed intelligence with up to 20 different senses with which they interact with the environment. They act intentionally and purposefully. They learn and have memories. They communicate with each other. Biologist Suzanne Simard has coined the term the wood wide web, for talking about how trees in a forest use a mycorrhizal fungal network underground to actually not just communicate with each other, but even to allocate resources as a community. And what is amazing is even if we extend below plants to the tiniest little cell, microscopic cell, cellular biologists now have come to recognize that even a single cell displays stunning intelligence. The awe-inspiring cellular intelligence is such that a single cell has thousands of different sensors and proteins within it. It sends and receives hundreds of different signals at a time. It's aware of itself and others. It knows what to do. Cells cooperate in community, and they even make decisions as a group. So modern biologists are beginning to uncover this awesome intelligence within nature itself. But in other cultures around the world, there was a deep understanding of this well before science began to look at the details around it. If we look, for example, at ancient China, many of you are probably familiar with the Tao Te Ching, which can be translated as the classic of Tao and Te. And Tao, of course, refers to the way or the path, or how the forces of nature manifest in the world. But equally important is this concept Te, like the spontaneity, the intrinsic nature inherent in all living things. And when the ancient Taoists looked at all natural and sentient beings around them, they saw the state of acting with Te. They called it Wu Wei, effortless action. And they saw like basically all non-human organisms acting naturally in Wu Wei. But what happened then to humans, the Taoists asked? Rather than acting in this effortless action, humans acted in what they called Yu Wei, or purposive action. Like they gave examples like using a fire to dry up a well, or forcing water uphill to irrigate a mountainside. And, you know, we might reasonably respond, well, isn't that what civilization is all about, is to do those kind of things? And the Taoists would have agreed. And they sort of developed from that like a theory of civilization. And Zhuangzi talked about how in ancient times, the humans belonged to the whole world in a state of perfect unity, that people lived in common with birds and beasts, in terms of equality with all creatures, basically forming one family. And then civilization came about. And in Zhuangzi's words, people began to be separated from one another with extravagant orchestras and all this complexity. And what's fascinating is that modern cognitive neuroscience has validated that Taoist theory of civilization. They have now identified our prefrontal cortex, uniquely advanced in humans, as mediating that Yu Wei cognition. Things like symbolic thought, conceptualizing, planning, creating abstractions. And cognitive anthropologists now recognize that that emergence of symbolic thought happened in very early human times with the emergence of language, of culture, of art, of tool making. So now modern cognitive neuroscientists understand that we have basically a dual human consciousness. We have that conceptual consciousness that Descartes considered was the only human identity, that's analytic, slow, rational, that Yu Wei consciousness. But in addition to that, we also have that animate consciousness that we share with all other animals out there, that's intuitive, fast, effortless. We have that Wu Wei within us too. And so our human challenge is to go beyond that pure identifying with that conceptual consciousness, but to integrate both systems in harmony. So now when we look at this question, who am I? We can begin to answer it, well, I am a mind-body organism that's capable of integration. So let's move on into this next question, where am I? And just like we did before, let's look first at what the dominant society says to answer this question. Well, basically, we're generally told in the dominant worldview that we live in a split universe where there's some kind of transcendent God in some other dimension in the material world below. And as a result of that, we've come to believe that it's reasonable and right that religion and science should exist in different domains and utterly separate from each other. And as a result, people have begun to sort of feel like it's okay to kind of pray to that transcendent source of meaning, even while we ransack nature below. But that's not how other cultures around the world through history saw our place in the universe. If we turn once again to China, this time a little later to the Song Dynasty, about 1,000 years ago, and we look at the group of sages that called themselves the School of the Tao in those days, they basically integrated, they synthesized the three great traditions of China: Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism, which was imported into China in the first few centuries AD. And in the Song Dynasty, the School of the Tao took these three groups and put them together in a synthetic way of understanding the universe that we now know nowadays as Neo-Confucianism. And for the Neo-Confucianists, the entire universe consists of qi, like matter and or energy, we might consider that. And that qi is connected according to certain principles that they called li. So qi could not come into existence in the Neo-Confucian idea without some way in which they were connected together. And those were the connections that were li. And the Neo-Confucians understood that the totality of all the li in the universe was the Tao. Now, what is so fascinating is that once again, in modern systems thinking, systems scientists also point to a connected universe, just like the ones that the Neo-Confucians understood, whether it's complexity science, systems biology, or chaos theory. All these disciplines show how everything is connected and in nonlinear ways. So in the famous words of Edward Lorenz, who developed chaos theory, when he asked, is it possible that the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil could cause a tornado in Texas through this nonlinear connectedness of all systems in the world? And when scientists look at the interactions between things, they find that oftentimes those interactions tell us more about the things than even the things themselves, whether we're looking at starlings flocking in the sky, or shoals of fish in the sea, or the ripples of sand dunes, or the entire global Earth system, or even the ways in which distant galaxies are organized. It's the connections are often more important than the actual stuff that they're connecting. Now, that's kind of a hard thing to get our head around sometimes. And so one way that we can do it is to take a pause for a moment. And I invite you to just think for a moment of a photograph of yourself when you were a little child. So try to get that in your mind. Here's one of me when I was a little kid. And when I look at that little kid, I know that's me. I might even have the memories to prove it. But here's the thing, there's not, almost none of the cells in that little kid are in me now. And even the cells that still, that stay in us all through our lives are always completely changing the molecular structure of which they're formed. So I know virtually for a fact that there's not a single molecule in me today, right now, that was in that little boy. So what connects me to that little boy? Well, the simple answer is it's the li. Those principles of connection between the stuff, the ways in which the cells are organized, the way in which the organs within that boy are organized, the way the neuronal patterns are organized. It's those connections that actually are the coherent stability of me that I recognize in that little boy, not the stuff that is getting connected. And when scientists look at these patterns in nature, they see one really crucial quality about patterns in self-organized systems, which is fractals. Fractals are patterns that repeat themselves at different scales, and they indicate self-organized activity, and they're everywhere in the natural world. We see them in coastlines, in the patterning on leaves, and lightning, the patterning in lungs, and the patterns of our neurons in our brain and our nervous system. And earth scientists have now begun to recognize that nature itself is a fractally connected system, with the principles by which the cell works coherently are essentially the same as the principles of the organism of which that cell is a part, which is fractally part of its species, which is a fractal part of its ecosystem. And all those ecosystems are a fractal part of the living earth itself, of Gaia, as some people will refer to it. So then when we think about where am I, rather than this split universe that we're told, we can actually begin to recognize that actually I am part of a fractally connected, self-organized universe. Well, what might that mean for what am I? So one way to begin coming at this question is to actually look at the very profound statement of one of the great leaders of the Neo-Confucian school in the Sung Dynasty, Chu Shi, who said, if one wishes to know the reality of Tao, one must seek it in one's own nature. But if we turn to our modern worldview, our dominant ideas, and we ask, well, what is our nature? Well, before too long, we'll get an answer that's got something to do with like Dawkins, Richard Dawkins and the selfish gene that he has popularized so powerfully throughout the sort of the thinking world over decades. So in the words of Richard Dawkins, we and all our other animals are machines created by our genes in a highly competitive world. And as he says, a predominant quality to be expected in a successful gene is ruthless selfishness. So what is believed in the sort of mainstream dominant worldview is that the gene is the fundamental unit of evolution, that it dictates everything about the organism, that it's inherently selfish and competitive. Most of us take that for granted. But actually what modern biology, what evolutionary biologists and systems biologists now have shown us is that each of those statements is actually false. It turns out the genes don't just dominate everything in the organism, rather they're part of an iterative process with the cell. They're part of a vibrant, dynamic, circular flow of interactivity with the cell and the organism. And we're told now by biologists that we can understand the genotype more as an artist's palette, basically like a repertoire of capabilities that the cell itself can select based on its particular needs as determined by the environment. And to give a sense of how powerful that is as a difference from what we believe about the gene, consider for a moment the cute little grasshopper that all of us know and love. We see on a leaf, gentle, solitary creature. Well, it turns out that grasshopper has exactly the same DNA as a massive swarm of locusts, aggressive swarms that can destroy millions of acres of land like overnight. And what happens is that grasshopper at certain points, its cells turn on different aspects of their genes, and they actually change their form. They even change their psychology to become locusts, and then they can change back again to the grasshopper. That's how much the cell can impact the actual gene itself. So what about if the gene doesn't dictate life, what about that selfishness? Have we just moved the selfishness from the gene to the organism? Well, here's what's so fascinating now from evolutionary biology. When we look at ever since life began on Earth billions of years ago, we now understand that every one of the major stages in increase in complexity in life, from single cells to complex cells, to multicellular life, to animals, to mammals, all came about through increases not in competition, but in cooperation, where different elements of organisms learned how to cooperate together to create, rather than a zero-sum game, something greater than the sum of the parts. Life evolved through cooperation. In the words of systems biologist Lynn Margulis, life did not take over the world by combat, but by networking. And the most powerful discovery that life itself made about cooperation, as we see just from this picture of the bee pollinating the flower there, is this notion of mutually beneficial symbiosis, where different organisms help each other to create something greater. And if you just go for a walk in a forest, you'll see symbiosis all around you in what we can think of as the harmonic dance of life, where plants photosynthesize and provide nourishment for the animals and insects. The insects pollinate the plants. The animals transport their seeds and fertilize the earth. The fungus regenerates all the dead matter to create more nutrients. And they even, through their mycorrhizal networks, like we talked about, transport nutrients for the plants elsewhere in the forest. Life is this harmonic dance of life through symbiosis. So as biologist Carl Wosser said, we need to understand organisms themselves as resilient patterns in a turbulent flow. He says we must come to see them not materialistically like machines, but as stable, complex, dynamic organization. And it's that forms this fractal cascade of abundance that we can glory in nature today. So when we ask, what am I? We can now, through the insights of modern science, begin to realize that actually what I am is a resilient pattern of self-organized cooperation. Which kind of leads to this next question, this key question we all ask: how should I live? And again, if we ask the dominant culture to give us the answer, it's a pretty clear answer. We're told humans are intrinsically selfish and greedy. And selfish behavior by individuals, we're told, is in the best interests of everyone. That's the core founding ideology of neoliberalism that's taken over our world for the last few decades, summarized by, in that movie Gordon Gekko in Wall Street, greed is good. And even those who disagree with the ideology of neoliberalism, and to his credit, Richard Dawkins is one of those, still sees it in terms of how we have to overcome those selfish genes. We have to teach generosity and altruism, he says, because we're born selfish. So if we understand what those selfish genes are up to, maybe we can upset their design. So it's this notion of fighting against our true nature. Well, actually, evolutionary biologists have shown that to be absolutely false. In fact, humans evolved to be cooperative. When early hominids millions of years ago found themselves in the savannah in a changeable environment, they were far more vulnerable to predators. Those who learned to collaborate found they were the most successful. And over millions of years, our human identity expanded from self and kin to include the entire group. And that human ability to cooperate with each other, even those who are not kin, is in fact what differentiates us from other primates. Over those millions of years, as we became modern humans, we developed what are called moral emotions. We feel them deep in our gut: compassion, guilt, shame, gratitude, embarrassment. These are the emotions that taught us how to live collaboratively together. And so we don't just act morally because we think we should. We do it because it actually feels right. And this is what indigenous cultures around the world have known and acted upon for millennia. In Africa, they have this key foundational concept, Ubuntu, which can roughly be translated as I am because you are. Here in North America, where I'm speaking from, the Lakota tribe have a phrase, Mitakuye Oyasin, which basically means we are all related. And they're not just talking about other humans, they're talking about all sentient beings with whom they share the earth, or all relatives. And so we can begin to understand that human flourishing itself is based on our intrinsic connectedness within ourselves, with others, with the natural world, and with the living earth. And human flourishing is fractal, just like everything else we've seen in nature, where each human mind-body organism is a fractal part of a larger community, which is a fractal part of the entire living earth. So from that understanding, we can come up with a different foundation for morality, which is really best expressed by the great 20th century humanitarian Albert Schweitzer, who said, I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. And as a result, in his words, I cannot but have reverence for all that is called life. That is the beginning and foundation of morality. So now as we look at this question, how should I live? We can begin to answer it from this foundation of, well, actually, I should live in reverence and care for all life. So let's move now to this final question. Why am I? And if we turn again to what our modern dominant culture tells us in answer to this question, well, it's a pretty bleak answer we get. In the words of this famous reductionist scientist, Steven Weinberg, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. There is no answer to this question, why am I? We live in a pointless universe. But once we start to recognize this deep connectedness within all things around us, we can begin to understand meaning itself as being a function of connectedness. So in any system in which we're embedded, as the number of connections increases, they lead to a phase transition and the emergence of new meaning. And we see this all around us in the systems with which we live our lives. When words connect in complex ways, language emerges. When organisms connect, an ecosystem emerges. When neurons connect, consciousness emerges. And I expect many of you have had some kind of peak experience in some time in your life when you felt that sense of this deep meaning, this deep sense of connectedness of all things, being part of something so much bigger than yourself. And so now we can realize that rather than say, well, that's very unscientific, that might be what I felt, but that can't be true because science tells us the opposite. Actually, we can recognize that that sense of oneness is this deep realization of what science itself is validating as the deep underlying reality of our connected universe. And that connectedness has profound implications. It basically is telling us that everything you do in your life creates these Lee ripples which affect everything else in the universe. This principle of the ultimate connectivity of everything in the cosmos. So we exist in an ocean of Lee. And the Lee ripples exist within each of us in the personal choices and actions that we take, the choices to participate in regenerative community or to engage in the broader political process. These are all parts of ultimately what weave the web of meaning in which we're all embedded. So now, as we look to this final question, why am I? We can see that what the findings of modern science begins to tell us is that actually the reason I'm here is to weave my part in that web of meaning. And perhaps if enough of us can recognize that, weave our part and act accordingly, perhaps we can regenerate our beautiful, fragile earth before it's too late. So this gives you just a very kind of brief high-level summary of what I go into some depth in this book, The Web of Meaning. There's actually these two editions with different covers, one for North America, one for the UK and Commonwealth. The books look different, the cover, every word is the same within the book, just so that you know. And what I'm going to do right now, before I move out of sharing the screen, is just pose to you all this question to pause and consider. Where are the opportunities in my own life to weave my part in the web of meaning? And now I'm going to ask you, I'm going to get out of screen sharing here, move into our full group. I'm going to ask that we break into breakout rooms, maybe 4 people per room, and spend maybe something like 12 minutes, I'm thinking might be a good, in those rooms. And I'll type that question in the chat again for you to have available. And I'm going to ask you, when you're in that breakout group, to share with the others in your room your own personal answer to that question of where are the opportunities in my own life to weave my part in the web of meaning. And once you've each had a chance to share that and connect with each other in that regard, let's come back to the full room here together. And I'd love to hear what some of you have, what arose from those discussions, and also answer any questions that arose from the presentation. And just let's engage in conversation together about that weaving of the web of meaning.
Great.
So thank you so much.
Jeremy, I'll send everybody into the rooms now. Yeah.
5 breakout rooms.
Great, exactly. That's perfect.
Oh, you have it?
I can do it. Yeah.
Okay.
And I see a message from Sarah there that your laptop is not allowing you to stay beyond right now. So thanks very much for listening, Sarah.
Okay. So actually, I'm going to adjust some things here, but we got about 4 people. Let me do something else really quick. I'm going to add a room. I'm going to and okay, great. So I'll send you guys out now to your breakout rooms.
Let me just say one thing before you break into breakout rooms. I'd like to see if we can make the technology work. I'll kind of hover in and out of some of these rooms, a little bit like a fly on the wall. So if you see me in the room, it's really valuable for me to engage and hear what you have to say, but you can just ignore me. You no need to engage in conversation with me, but I'll just sort of come in and then maybe hover back out again at some point. So just wanted to give you the heads up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. Okay, so I'll send you in and for about 12 minutes. So we have until about 30 minutes after the hour. And we'll bring everybody back in. Thank you. So go ahead and click on moving to the room. Okay, it looks like room 4.
Looks like room 4, yeah, only has 2 people.
It has 2 people.
Maybe you can.
Is not joined. Yeah. So Tara can actually go to. I'm going to move her to room 4. Yep.
Great.
So move Tara to room 4.
Okay.
She can have the discussion.
Yeah. Great.
And
okay. So yeah, just figured I'd touch base with you for a moment, but then sure. I might just join the rooms because that's a great way to really feel into how people are thinking about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, any feedback on that or any thoughts what you
want
to cover?
I have my own questions and I want to be like, oh wait, So and I have to say I'm only about, I'd say 25 to 30% of the way through the book. But the way you've written it, it's very personal, it's very real. And yeah, just really incredibly insightful. I'm enjoying it. I keep telling people about it because I think it's yeah, it's really good. Like I'm really
glad to hear it. Great.
Yeah, it's a great
Thanks.
But yeah, I mean I'll engage in maybe some questions as well when we come back in.
Excellent. Yeah. It might be good to have 1 or 2 questions on it because sometimes it's difficult for people to break the ice for the first question and then it gets going. Okay, cool.
Yep, great. All right. Enjoy. Yep. You can move yourself, I think. Can you? You know how to move yourself? Join the different rooms.
Optimistic. Hello. Yeah.
Great. So I've remembered to record this time. So we have about 25 minutes remaining, and in that time, I guess we're going to engage in some of the discussion that Jeremy's going to take us through, including some opportunities to ask Jeremy questions. So Jeremy, I hand it back over to you. Oh, I think you're on mute. Can't hear you.
Okay. Right. I think that's good now. So yeah, as I said before we went into the breakout rooms, what I'd love to hear is one, if any of you had anything you wanted to share from those breakout room discussions for the whole community, that would be great to hear. And if you had any questions specifically to what I was saying in the presentation, something that that you had a question about, it didn't make sense to you, or that you'd like to explore a little bit further, this is a great opportunity. Or if you just want to really share some of your thoughts about this web of meaning that we're all in, and how that can lead us towards the kind of transformation that we need so desperately in the world right now, I'm very open to hear any perspectives you all have. So I see two participants raised their hand. Looks like Michelle, I think you.
And,
oh, yeah.
And sorry, Michelle. Go ahead. Michelle.
Thanks, Garrett. Sure, Jeremy, this was amazing. So first of all, I'm sure probably most people in this group are from Singapore. I'm not. I'm from South Africa. It's around about 5 o'clock in the morning. And what was so beautiful in our group was it first started off with two people saying, "Hey, buddy, long time no see." And I was like, "Look, there's a web." And for me, the connection there was, well, that's kind of how I ended up here. Was somewhere across in Europe, there's an international group of us that met at the beginning of the pandemic. And she sent us a link to one of your talks, Jeremy, and then jumped on the book. And then there were two others in this group, Kenny and Anna, who sent this to me. And I was like, I'm joining. I'm definitely not going to miss out there. So for me, it was such an alive, living example of what you were talking about in terms of this web of meaning and this interconnectedness. That was just such a beautiful, beautiful noticing for me. And then, of course, the second one I've been sitting with for quite a while. Just, I think it's because I'm quite active and supported by this international community of individuals that I'm exposed to a lot of international thinking that is advanced in the sense of how complexity science and the work that you're bringing together is just so beautifully articulated. But what fascinates me is consistently, somehow, in one way or another, there are examples of African traditions, principles of Ubuntu. And interestingly, my lineage is in fact from Java and China and India, yet I sit in Africa. So there's another web there. But, you know, more and more through this pandemic and apartheid, it's traumatized, you know, Africa to the extent that we've forgotten how to be connected, yet it is also very much what got us through those wars, that got us through these challenges. And so it's so beautiful to see that these expert practitioners and advanced thinkers like yourself are bringing in these beautiful traditions. And it feels as though perhaps we need to start bringing back some of those basic traditions in our countries that have been forgotten and lost. So I'm actually super keen to get you on a call to South Africans so that we can have this conversation. I certainly see that as an opportunity. And Anna and Kenny, thank you so much for bringing me onto this call, because it's given me new meaning. You know, this pandemic has really opened my eyes to the importance of actually being connected. You know, I've been working from home for a couple of years, but it was only the last 2 or 3 months that I realized, hang on a minute, I've become a bit of a recluse, and I'm actually longing the interconnectedness and the relationship of being with people out in the world, creating kind of a resonance field and participating in it, that I didn't realize that I was quite distressed, quite stressed. And the more I started to engage physically with the world again, the more I started to become aware of that. And so this is just another.
Yeah. I mean, thanks so much for sharing that, Michelle. And I think that's something we all feel so much, is that that need to reconnect in ways. And at the same time, of course, what COVID has done and the technology is allowed us to all get comfortable with these global communities, which is just amazing. I feel so much more connected with so many more parts of the world now than I did before. So yeah, it's been a strange dynamic. And thanks for the ideas about reaching out to South Africa. It sounds great. So yeah, so let's move over to Robert. I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, at the end of our breakout session, I dropped an example of trying to draw a more practical, I guess, example that is very controversial right now, which is the whole idea of social media, right? And its use to, in theory, connect people and keep them connected, but it's obviously been very destructive in destroying families, destroying friendships, and even countries, right? And as a user of Facebook or LinkedIn, to connect with past students or to learn. I want to just ask you how you see the tool of social media and how, because of maybe our values, separation values, and our selfish, or this thinking that we are selfish by nature, how can we better leverage rather than just, how do you say, incriminate or say that social media is bad? How do we use this tool in a much more effective way to connect in a web of life and sharing that isn't actually leading us to accelerating our separation and our destruction, right? So
yes. No, I hear what you're saying. It's such a key question. And we're all only too familiar with how, these, at first the promise looked so amazing of this interconnectedness and all the things we could do. And we've seen the silos and the polarization and just the terrible outcomes. But my own sense is that we need, in order to understand this better, we need to look at the context of the social media, which is the global capitalist system, which is designed to exploit and to extract. And above all, is in the hands of these corporations that have no other end than to make as much money as possible for their shareholders. Yeah. And we have to remember that all the time, because when we talk about how social media has gone wrong or whatever, it's actually that we see that in virtually any technology that's been developed, that when technology is developed and implemented in a for-profit way, and even if people like the sort of Google founders or the Facebook or whoever had these good notions, I want to do good in the world. And we can accept maybe they did have the very best of intentions. The point is that it gets sucked into this capitalist profit maximization system, which is now dominated, so dominant that basically everything in the world is essentially been sucked into it almost. And when it's part of that system, we have to recognize that Facebook is incented to, we all probably know these statistics that a false statement on Facebook, a false claim, is something like 10 times more viral than a true statement. And Facebook is in the business of making money from advertising dollars. So of course, they're going to be incented to let the systems then work on that. So those false claims get to be more and more polarizing. So I think that ultimately we have to talk about the elephant in the room. I actually just wrote an article saying that the climate crisis itself ultimately can only be solved with the end of capitalism. I mean, if I was talking before about our worldview of separation, this global system of capitalism is basically the ultimate manifestation of that worldview of separation, looking at everything as a resource to exploit. So if Facebook were taken over and as a utility and owned by the commons, and if it was like reoriented so that everyone who is part of it actually shared the ownership of it, we'd see entirely different dynamics develop. So the issue is not so much with the technology, I think, but with the context of that technology.
Jeremy, can I step in here real quick? Because one of the things that I'm looking at with some of the project work I'm doing is the use of what's called economics of mutuality. I don't know if you've heard of that before, but it measures not just the financial capital, but it looks like the social capital, the human capital, and the natural capital exchanges between the organization. Now, as you're saying, that the problem I think is that's not going to change shift the needle quickly enough, but it has, I think, the right engagement level to recognize there are the other forms of capital that the organization draws upon in its operations and its impact, right? Its connectedness across that, again, the human, social, and natural capitals as well. But that's something that I see some private equity firms engaging with and some organizations now thinking about, how do they really engage that? And so there's an actual group that folks, that's out of the Mars Inc. Catalyst think tank.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that, Garrett. That's great.
I want to get to Anna's question as well. So Anna has her hand up. I have a point that I want to make at the end, but Anna, please go ahead.
Thanks, Garrett. Thank you so much, Jeremy. I joined somewhat late, so perhaps I missed it. what you were saying, but coming with my background, scientific background, I wanted to ask you, so you know, the theory of evolution coined by Darwin that spoke about competition.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was taken out into, you know, a lot of social theories, kind of how it's all about competition. And you're talking about collaboration, symbiosis, which is also clearly a natural phenomenon. So I'm wondering, in your mind, how do you reconcile the two?
Yeah, sure. It's great. I'm not sure if you saw the part of the presentation where I looked at some of those evolutionary ideas about competition and cooperation. But in general, I think what's important is to realize that, you know, when I and other systems thinkers and biologists talk about cooperation, no one is saying that there is not competition in the natural world. Competition is absolutely a part of ecosystems, a part of how organisms relate with each other. I think what's important to understand is that competition and cooperation are themselves basically like human constructs. Organisms themselves aren't necessarily thinking, oh, I'm in competition with this organism there or there, but they're kind of working how to optimize. And we can see both competition and cooperation as really two elements of nature's own, the intelligence of ecosystems, which essentially is how to maximize the negative entropy that life creates, like taking energy from the sun and turning it into all the richness and abundance of ecosystems, et cetera. And so I discuss this in some detail in the book, but I think the most accurate, I think scientifically accurate and richer way to look at this question is to kind of leave behind this debate, which can get somewhat sterile of, oh, are we mostly competitive or is nature mostly cooperative or whatever? The evolutionary biology does show that the great stages of change in evolution to more complexity does arise from increased cooperation. So that's, I think, pretty much a fact right now. But we need to look at nature itself as being more like this harmonic combination of cooperation and competition, acting to create this richness of ecosystems. And when we look at how we could best optimize for human society, it's not to say that we should have a society where there is no competition and we're just all cooperative together. That is unnatural for all of us as human beings. It's unnatural for organisms. But where we are right now in our society, which has this ideology of competitiveness, which claims that all of nature is purely competitive, that's just an absolute myth. And what we need to do is move towards a balance where we truly get the richness of having, when competition is part of a bigger system, it can be not like destructive, not trying to break down the other person, but actually trying to be the best you can within a peer group. And that can be incredibly appealing and like get the best out of all of us.
Thank you. That resonates. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks.
Sorry, Robert, you have your hand raised again. You want to ask another question or?
Sorry, I meant to lower it. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
One of the things, Jeremy, that I'm, you know, I guess my experience has been in life that I lived in New York City and I live now in Singapore. And it's very concentrated. I lived in Hong Kong beforehand, so very concentrated populations. As much as, you know, we sit there and say, well, you know, it's about those connections and not being sort of isolated. I find that I'm most lonely in those moments.
Yeah.
that I feel least connected with anything and most alone in those moments. And it takes me getting into nature to come to that sort of, I guess, sort of, I don't know if it's the Wu Wei sort of point, but just that sense of at ease and at peace, right? And feeling connected. And so that's why I'm heading into the mountains as of maybe today here, is to kind of just reconnect with nature. You know, I was sitting on a kayak in the Mediterranean yesterday, and that's when I was just feeling those moments, you know, just out looking at the ocean in that connection. So I'm curious, how do you reconcile that? Is it that we have too many people? That there's just an overpopulated world and we miss the quality of connections for quantity? Or You know, what is your sense of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few really interesting and important points come out of your question. I mean, one is the question of overpopulation. Another is a question of cities themselves, and how they're designed, basically. And I think let's maybe first take a look at this big question of overpopulation, because that's oftentimes when I was talking about capitalism as the elephant in the room, and oftentimes people say, no, the real elephant in the room is population. And there's no doubt that we have too many people on the earth right now to allow for full flourishing. But what I think is so interesting is that ultimately the ways, what scientists now understand, the ways to actually solve overpopulation is actually the stuff that the same changes that are required to introduce well-being into communities, which essentially is greater education, and more than anything, education of girls and empowerment of women. That has been shown unequivocally in country by country to be the most significant lever that brings population down more quickly, more reliably than anything else. So when we think of overpopulation, we need to realize that the reason for the ecological devastation and the climate breakdown that we're looking at is not actually overpopulation per se. If you look at, because it's more to do with the fact that basically just 20% of the world, the 20% who live in the affluent global north, essentially, or some of the elites in the global south, are responsible for roughly 80% of the climate breakdown, of emissions, and of consumption that has caused this situation right now. So oftentimes people in the United States or others like, oh, will say, there's like those people in the South, they need to like stop producing so many people. That's what the problem is. That's just total nonsense. The biggest impact that can happen for actual reduction of our footprint on the earth is for a shift in the ways in which people in the global north actually live, moving from consumption to greater quality of life, which leads to your other question about cities. I mean, what is fascinating is that cities are actually more ecologically efficient for negative entropy and for reduced impact on nature than living rurally or certainly suburbanly or whatever. And we know more than 50% of humans now live in cities. And by the middle of this century, that number is going to be more like 70%. And while that seems daunting in one hand, it's actually one of the positive trends, because the ultimate potential that we have is what E.O. Wilson, the great scientist, calls half Earth, to give half of Earth back to nature and to cluster ourselves as human beings more in this city, which then leads to this question, well, what about this connecting with nature? And then what are we meant to do? And I think that what we need to recognize is that cities themselves don't need to be these alienating, lonely places that they have become. If we recognize that, again, it's the global capitalist way in which these cities have evolved that leads to that. If we actually redesign cities based on more ecological principles, with public transportation free, essentially, to everyone, with much more localized communities, so that everything you'd want, like the groceries and the community center, everything like that, was no more than 15 to 20 minutes walk away from wherever you are living, and where you had where you actually had green areas within the cities. So you're able to sort of touch into some of the natural world, even there in the city itself. The whole quality of life could be different. And then I could envisage longer term in the future where the trips out into that 50% of the earth that was truly rewilded would be something that would be this kind of apportioned out, that everybody would want to have those connections, but it would want to be done in a way that we didn't then just go and pollute what was there on the natural earth. Like right now in the United States, you have these beautiful state parks, which are again getting devastated by traffic jams of people coming to like sort of enjoy the wildflowers or whatever. So we have to really give nature its primacy, and we have to learn how to live as humans within more urban environments, but then really treasuring the time we spend outside in nature.
Thank you. Sounds like you should write a futuristic sort of movie about how we would live, right? What would that look like? And in part, Singapore almost with the community centers that it has and the gardens, right? It's called the Garden City, has a bit of that, right? So as much as it continues to I think, build on some of its natural wildlife, it does have a bit of that. So that's quite interesting. Any other, great, thank you, Jeremy. Any other questions? Open it up to the group.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yes, so one of the things about cities is also for buildings themselves are responsible for 70% of carbon. And so there's been movements in many cities, New York being one of them, about really carbon reduction and what is that plan, and more across the globe in terms of sustainable urbanization. And also, interestingly enough, in terms of nature, I know in New York, I don't know if you were there, Garrett, during Superstorm Sandy, but the waters that came in, many ways, the areas most flooded were the areas that were built on landfill. And so the water was taking back what were her natural boundaries. So I think that there is hopefully there'll be more of a growing consciousness within cities in that regard as well, in terms of allowing nature to come back in, and being able to live with that and to use design and technology where there are ways where people and nature and waters coming in could really, the way they do in the Netherlands, where it's much more part of the consciousness of the city.
Yeah. Thank you, Maxine. Yeah.
You're welcome.
So we have just about 2 minutes left. I guess this is a good point, Jeremy, for you to put some final touches on your presentation and discussion today.
Yeah, great, thanks. Well, I guess, yeah, the one thing that we've sort of just we touched on, but haven't really looked at it in detail, is this, the way I sort of started the presentation off, just looking at the destruction that is taking place on the earth right now. And so I would just really leave with an invitation to each of you as you think about this notion of how we're all part of this web of meaning, is recognizing that we're all part of co-creating the future. And that right now we are headed for a desperately destructive future. We're headed for a future where our own children and grandchildren of future generations are going to be inheriting a devastated earth. And so to the extent that we recognize that each of us has a part to play in that web of meaning, and each of us that has the privilege to be able to think about what we're doing with our lives and make decisions and spend our energy where we have some choice, flexibility where we do that, to realize that there's nothing we can do more meaningful right now than to take that extra energy and to do it in the service of life, whatever that means for each of you. But life is under attack right now from this global civilization. It's not under attack from humanity. Don't let somebody tell you, oh, humanity is this cancer on the earth. The capitalist global for-profit civilization we're in right now is a cancer on this earth and is destroying the abundance of life on earth. So whatever each of you can do in your part to really like get behind that and act accordingly, to act for life, like let's do it together.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. Excellent. And really some really important, I guess, thoughts and reflections on our interconnections and the natural interconnections that we have. The book itself, I've mentioned to Jeremy, I'm about only 25% into it, but it is a very easy read, very personal, authentic, well-written framing that I've learned just tons of just from reading the 25%, the introduction and into some of the work. So thank you very much for putting that together, Jeremy. I recommend that everybody think about getting it. In regard to the Society for Organizational Learning, just put in the chat the website for you guys to go to if anybody's interested in membership, for those of you based in Singapore, around Asia, if you're not already, and for those of you interested in the Society for Organizational Learning, obviously there's a global network of chapters around the world. So thank you very much, everybody. It is 10 o'clock, or sorry, not 10 o'clock. It is, what time we start? 12 o'clock in Singapore, 6 o'clock here, 5 o'clock for, is it Michelle? No, who was in South Africa. So thank you, everybody, for joining. and have a wonderful day ahead. Appreciate you coming on board today. And thank you, Jeremy, for being here yet again. So
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Have a blessed weekend ahead.
Right.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's really good.